Every night before I go to bed, I sit at the feet of the couch and watch television with my wife and rub her feet. And one predictable result of this is that she gets drowsy. And sometimes we go to bed together, and sometimes I'm not quite ready. And she goes on up to bed, and I have the opportunity to watch something on television that I would never be able to watch otherwise. Like a sports documentary, for example. Or sometimes, if I'm feeling virtuous, I'll watch something in Spanish to improve, or at least, stay actively working my Spanish language skills. And this past week, I watched a Spanish language documentary on Netflix called The Lost Children. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I highly recommend it. And it tells the story of a small plane that took off from a remote indigenous community in the Colombian Amazon rainforest, and with 7 passengers, well, 6 passengers and 1 pilot on board. And after a couple of hours, the engine started to have problems, and the plane crash landed in the middle of the Amazon. And so a large search and rescue operation was mounted, and after a couple of weeks of looking, the Colombian military found the downed aircraft. And some special forces rappelled from helicopters into the crash site, where they found the 3 adults who had been on the plane, their bodies, because all had died, including the mother of 4 children, the oldest aged 13 and the youngest an infant of 11 months, who they did not find. And so the rest of the film is about the search for these 4 children who had mysteriously vanished into the rainforest. And the story of what happened to the people who were looking for them. Which, first of all, was these special forces of the Colombian army, who began their search on the ground heavily armed, because that region, like much of the areas of Colombia outside of the urban centers, has been for decades a haunt of various armed revolutionary groups. So even as they were, searching methodically through the jungle, they were also watchful and wary and fearful that they might be attacked. Something that never happened. And then, after weeks of fruitless searching, they were joined by volunteers from the indigenous communities of the Colombian Amazon. People who themselves were rightly fearful and suspicious of the special forces of the Colombian military, because for decades their villages had been attacked and their children and brothers and fathers disappeared by those same forces that were now searching through their territory for the 4 lost children. And over the course of the story, over the course of weeks of fruitlessly searching for the children, the whole country became obsessed with this story. Every night there would be updates on the news broadcasts. It was headlines all across the country when weeks into the search, a child's shoe was discovered, or a used diaper, or a pacifier was found on the floor of the jungle, giving hope to the whole nation that these lost children would be found. Eventually, after weeks, during which many strange things occurred, and the brave Special Forces soldiers came to a new sense of the eerie and uncanny nature of the jungle that they were searching in, because of odd phenomena like GPS compasses that would just spin rather than pointing predictably to the north, and other vague references to eerie things that they saw at night. They came to the conclusion that for all of their equipment and training and scientific approach to the search, they had failed. And that their role from now on was to support the indigenous volunteers who would rely on their indigenous knowledge and understanding of the forest to continue the search. And so, guided by their shaman and by various forms of plant medicine, the indigenous men continued, again, fruitlessly, looking for the lost children, until finally they decided that they needed to bring out the heavy artillery, which for them was an extract of a particular vine that grows in the forest that they call yahe, which is better known to people in our culture as ayahuasca. Incidentally, on one of those sports documentaries, I saw that Aaron Rodgers, the future Hall of Fame quarterback, formerly of the Green Bay Packers, and now looking for a new job, also took some of that medicine once, but that's another story. Anyway, they asked the people back in their village to cook up a batch. And the Special Forces lowered it from their aircraft to the helicopter to the encampment, where together with the shaman, the search party imbibed the medicine and received a vision of where the children were to be found, and got up the next morning and walked for miles in the direction that they had been guided to follow, and indeed, about midday, heard the cry of the infant coming from a thicket. And the images of these indigenous men having come back to their camp, meeting the Green Berets who had parachuted or rappelled down from the helicopters with medics and falling upon each other, embracing one another tearfully, joy and relief and disbelief at the miraculous discovery of the 4 children alive, though on the very brink of perishing from malnutrition. To see the images of Green Berets and indigenous shaman riding together on flatbed trucks through the streets of the capital of the country as throngs of thousands of their fellow citizens cheered them on as heroes. To hear the general of the armed forces saying, "We are a nation of mestizos," a mix of indigenous and Afro-American and Euro-American ancestry, and we need to recognize that that is our identity. And only in that way can our country finally be at peace. To hear the stories of the indigenous men, one of whom, the young man who actually found the children, talking about how as a young child about the age of the eldest daughter himself had been kidnapped from his village and made a child soldier, given a weapon and pressed into the service of one of Colombia's armed revolutionary groups. Or the other man whose father and brother had been disappeared in a massacre by the Colombian Special Forces. To hear them speaking of their journey of forgiveness and transformation that had been made possible for them by being given this leading role on behalf of their entire nation, using their own indigenous knowledge to find the 4 lost children. An extraordinary story of the possibility of reconciliation in a country deeply divided by hostility and suspicion and cultural prejudice and war. And yet there were some disturbing unanswered questions at the end of the documentary, like the fact that the children, while having been restored to good health, were still in the custody of the Colombian equivalent of Child Protective Services, because it came out in the course of the search for them that their father, who one would assume would have regained custody of them, had been credibly accused of abusing their mother and them. And likewise, today's gospel story, while we may be tempted to see it as a simple tale of forgiveness and reconciliation, if we can avoid the temptation to simply turn it into an allegory or drive it to a simple moralistic conclusion, also leaves us with some troubling questions. questions about what it really takes to be, as we are called to be, reconcilers. People who carry the ministry of reconciliation in our families, in our church, in our communities, and our nation. So the Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, points out that right from the very beginning, when Jesus says there was a man who had 2 sons, we know that there's going to be trouble. Because stories like that in the Hebrew Scriptures, well, just to name a few examples, Cain and Abel, or Ishmael and Isaac. How about Jacob and Esau? Or Joseph and his brothers. You remember that one? They sold him into slavery and off he went to Egypt. And interestingly enough, in all of these stories, it's the younger of the 2 or more sons who turns out to be kind of the focal point of the story. It's Isaac, not his older brother Ishmael, who is the bearer of Abraham's promise. It's Jacob, not Esau, the firstborn, who manages through subterfuge and connivance on his mother's part to receive his father's blessing. And so likewise, in the gospel story, it's the younger son who appears to be the focus of the story and the recipient of his father's favor. He asks for his share of the inheritance before his father dies, and his indulgent father gives it to him. And when, after he's squandered all of his money on dissolute living and finds himself hungry in a far-off country and all out of options, the younger son thinks to himself, well, I still have one card to play. Good old Dad. And so he rehearses his speech that he's going to give when he gets home. Father, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I have sinned against heaven and against you. Make me like one of your hired hands. And off he goes. And sure enough, when his father sees him, clearly he's been watching for him, because he sees him when he's still far away. His beloved younger son coming home. And he runs out and takes compassion on him and embraces him. And before he can even finish his speech, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The father interrupts. Go get the best robe in the house. Bring a ring. Put it on his finger. Let's kill the fatted calf. We must celebrate. The one who was lost has been found. The one who was dead has come back to life. And we don't know, we never find out whether that younger son's repentance and contrition were genuine or not. Because all of a sudden, we remember that other son. There was another son, wasn't there? And somehow he didn't get invited to the party. He's still out there where he always is, in the field, doing his duty, obeying his father's commands. And so the father all of a sudden realizes, I need to go and find that other son of mine? He goes and speaks to him and urges him, trying to comfort him and reassure him that he too is a member of the family, that he too is valued and loved. But it's in that moment that he discovers that this elder son of his, who by all appearances was faithful and loyal and trustworthy, has actually been feeling full of resentment against his father, tired of being taken for granted. And when he sees that other son of yours, as he says, come back, having squandered half of the family's fortune, and now his father is falling all over him again, killed the fatted calf, singing and dancing. He doesn't even want to go into the house. And the father says, "Son, you are always with me. You are, all that I have is yours. But we must celebrate because your brother has come home. The one that was lost has been found. The one that had died has come back to life." And that's the end of the story. So what happens? Does the older son forgive his brother? Does he forgive his father? Does this deeply divided family reunite joyfully, forgive one another, fall all over each other with tears of contrition and forgiveness, and embrace one another? We don't know. One can imagine some fairly awkward scenes if in fact the older brother does show up at the party. And what about the younger son? Will he make good on his supposed change of heart once the party's over? Jesus doesn't say. And these lingering questions and doubts, I think, speak to the difficulty that reconciliation really poses to us. We'd love to imagine that it's as simple as saying, "I forgive you," or "Please forgive me." But it rarely is. It rarely is in families. It rarely is in churches. It rarely is between estranged groups within a society or a nation. And yet Jesus, who ate and drank with tax collectors and sinners, nevertheless calls us to that work. Not simply to press on to the happy ending. Not simply to figure out, okay, you were in the wrong, I was in the right, or I was in the wrong and you were in the right, but we are divided and estranged from one another. What do we do now? When we imagine our task of being reconciled to those who are estranged, for example, from the gospel of Jesus Christ, who do we imagine? Who do we imagine inviting to rejoin us around the table of communion? Well, maybe the easy people, would be those with whom we share some basic values, and all we need to do is to convince them that we are really the nice Christians. We're the forgiving and inclusive and friendly kind of Christians, and you can come and cozy up with us. But what about those scary Christians who feel as if, well, I've always been faithful. I never went anywhere. I've been doing my Father's commands. And the things that I do, the politics that I have, are simply the expression of my faith. Maybe we know people like that in our own families. How will we be reconciled to them? Jesus doesn't give us easy answers. He does call us to follow him, to take up our cross as the sign of his reconciling love, God's reconciling love for the world. Do we have the humility and courage, and most importantly, the patience, willingness to struggle, to suffer, and to remain committed to reconciliation in spite of the cost, in spite of the fear, in spite of the estrangement